My clock is a little slow. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back from lunch. I'm, as you might remember, Father James Dominic ROONEY, and I'm going to chair this session. We have three professors up now, each having about 25 minutes to present. We have a little change to the program, which is our second paper is actually a joint paper. So I will introduce them later. But the first paper will be from Jeremiah JOAQUIN, who is from De La Salle University in the Philippines on Tertullian's entailment barrier. Thank you. Please take it away.
Thanks, Father. Sorry, Father. Yes. Thanks for the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. Thanks, Professor Kaiman Kwan, Andrew Luke, LOKE, and of course, Tien-Chun, and the organizers from the Asian Society for Philosophy of Religion. Now, this is a work in progress paper. It's entitled Tertullian's Entailment Barrier. And let's start. Okay, so my aim in this talk is to explore an entailment barrier thesis, which stems from the work of Tertullian, entitled Der Carne Christi Liber, or the Body of Christ. Now, here's the outline. We'll talk about what entailment barriers are, then I'll talk about Tertullian and the history of the book that I'm getting this work from. I'll try to formulate the barrier thesis using several logical machinery later, and I'll talk about the ramifications and further considerations of this barrier. Okay, so let's search for entailment barriers. Now, we're all familiar with what valid arguments are. It looks like that. Here's a conclusion B, and here's a premise A, and we're saying that it's a valid argument if and only if B follows from A. Now, another way of cashing it out is in terms of a model theoretic definition, wherein we're trying to figure out the connection between the conclusion and premises in terms of models or truths and possible worlds or truths and cases. So validity here is defined as A generates B, or B follows from A if and only if there's no case where A is true while B is not true. Now, we are also concerned about invalidity as well. So here's a definition of invalidity. We're saying that B does not follow from A if and only if there's a case where A is true while B is not true. So this is just elementary logic. But some say that there's a special kind of non sequiturs, and they're the entailment barriers, as Gillian Russell defines them. The idea here is that you can't get conclusions of a certain kind from premises of another kind. So what do we mean by this? So here's the idea. Here's a conclusion B, here's a premise A, and we're saying B does not follow from A because A and B are of different types. They're sentences of different types. But what do we mean by this? What do we mean when we say that no B-type conclusions follow from A-type premises? Now, here's one way of looking at it, but let's look at it by examples. Here's Bertrand Russell's famous thesis that particulars do not follow from generals or universals. So you can't have sums from alls. Here's another one. It's from Henri Poincaré. So he's saying that you can't have an imperative, do X or whatever, from an indicative like P. Or perhaps here's another famous one. You can't have an ought from an is, and that's the famous David Hume's no ought from is thesis. Or another Humean thesis that no future from the past, you can't have statements about the future from statements about the past. Now, in this talk, I want to present another barrier thesis. And that barrier thesis is what I'm calling the Tertullian's barrier. And this is a thesis that you can't have eternity from temporality. That is, you can't have statements about eternity or the divine from statements about the mundane or the temporal. But here's some considerations that we need to think about. You might say, there might be trivial counterexamples to a barrier thesis. For example, if you're into logic, you can have explosion. So from a contradiction of statement A, it could entail the statement B from another kind of statement. Or you could have a LEM type of argument, or the law of excluded argument, law of excluded middle argument, where you have a premise A, then you conclude B or not B. Of course, you could be non-classical. I'm a non-classical logician, by the way, so I'm interested in these type of non-classical logics, like the logical paradox that prohibit explosion, or a K3 logic, which prohibits LEM or LEM, or an FDE, which prohibits both kinds of inferences. But for the purposes of this paper, we're staying at classical logic, and we'll try to rule out trivial counterexamples just by adding a no trivial counterexample clause in our formulation of any barrier thesis. I think there are more potent problems that we'll talk about later, like prior-like dilemmas, Geach-like nesting problems, and Jorgensen's dilemmas, but we'll see them later. Now, my aims, as I've said, is to formulate the barrier and explore their ramifications and consider some possible objections against it. So here's Tertullian. You know him, I know him as the first century philosopher slash theologian, doctor of the church, and he's famous for his views about the incarnation. Here's the book that I'm looking at. So the translation I'm using is the Evans translation of 1956. Just some background. So Tertullian wrote Der Carne in 208, while he's thinking of monism. Monism is just the view that there are spiritual sides, spiritual truths that we can know directly. Now, this work was his polemic against the Marcionite heresy, the heresy that tells us that Christ is only divine and not human. So the main issue here is about Christ's dual nature. Is Christ just divine, or is he also human? So Marcion is, again, established theologian during that time, and his position was Christ is just God. He's just divine. He's not human because he was not actually born of the flesh, but was a phantasma of human form. So there's no real body of Christ. He's just a divine being. But, and here's the problem, if Christ is only divine and not human, then this puts into question Christ being God incarnate and the doctrine of resurrection. Now, more on church history. So the doctrine of incarnation, that Christ is God incarnate, was first discussed in the Council of Nicaea, then refined in the Council of Ephesus, then fully established in the Council of Chalcedon. This means that the Marcionite heresy and Tertullian's reply to it predates this doctrine. So I think Tertullian helped establish this doctrine. All right, so what are Marcion's reasons for saying that God is not God incarnate? Well, because it involves an impossibility, and it is a shameful degradation of divine nature. So here's an impossible Christology. If you're familiar with the work of J.C. Beale on contradictory Christology, he has this kind of argument. So if Christ is divine, then he cannot change, being God. If he's human, then he can change. Then you have that contradiction implied by those two theses. So for Marcion, this is an impossibility, so we can't have the thesis that Christ is human. About the shameful degradation of divine nature. Well, for Marcion, being embodied is undignified. I think that part here about the nastiness of genital elements in the womb or whatever establishes that conclusion that being embodied, being of flesh, is undignified. So here's Tertullian's rejoinder. Well, I won't read the Latin because I might mispronounce it and Father will hate me for it. So here's an English translation for Tertullian. Nothing is impossible to God except what he does not wish to do. So concerning embodiment, he'll say, how can we be certain that being embodied is undignified? Being embodied is part of the doctrines of the church. So Marcion's reasons undermine the Christian faith. How about and here's the Tertullian paradox, if you're familiar. So it's just the idea that we believe in God because it is impossible. So regarding impossible Christology, and this is the heart of the matter, he'll say, well, nothing is on equal terms with God. His nature is far removed from the circumstances of all things whatsoever. So quoting Bernard Williams, to argue for an impossible Christology is to argue falsely from the nature of temporal objects to the nature of the eternal and infinite. That is, since God's nature is far removed from the circumstances of all temporal things, one cannot argue for the nature of these temporal things to the nature of the eternal and infinite. And that is what I'm calling Tertullian's entailment. Barrier. You can't have eternity from temporality. Now, the challenge will be to make this thesis more precise. And I'll try to formulate it using three particular logical devices. One is temporal logic. The other one is the off-topic logic and the bimodal logic that J.C. Beale has developed recently. Okay. Let's go to the standard temporal logic. So here's one way of looking at Tertullian's barrier. So let T there be temporality, while the E there will be eternity. So you can't have eternity from temporality. Okay, so how can we make this precise? Here's one way. Take Pryor's temporal logic, Arthur Pryor. It's just a standard temporal logic without branching. Then you could have the tense operators there, was, is, will, and so on. Then you could have that kind of earlier than relation. Forget about the technicalities. Here's how we can translate that in terms of Tertullian's barrier. We'll just say E is a statement, all true statements about the past, present, and future, something like that. And temporality will be something like this, all temporally true statements. So therefore, here's the formulation of the barrier thesis. You can have statements, true statements about the past, present, future from contingent or temporal statements. Now, when I presented this in one of the conferences, Lloyd Humberson asked the question, wait, that kind of formulation is not really about eternity, it's just about empty eternity, which Martin Neal defines as objects which exist at all times, while eternal ones exist timelessly. So I think this is a bad formulation of Tertullian's barrier. But there's another one that we could use, and this is the formulation by J.C. and A.J. Cotnor in 2022. And they're using a kind of bimodal idea. So take standard modal logic, define two types of possibility out of this. So define divine possibilities on the one hand and creaturely possibilities on the other, and build the logic around this. And we could have something like this. So we define all eternity statements as all true modal statements about the sacred or divine things or divine possibilities, while T will be all true modal statements about the profane or creaturely possibilities. Then you could have this kind of barrier. You can't have divine possibilities from creaturely possibilities. Now, I think there's a more straightforward way of cashing out the thesis, and this is the off-topic formulation that JC, myself, have been developing in the past few years. So here's the idea. So take standard logic, you don't need modal logic, just standard logic, and divide the atoms in that logic into two sets of topics. You have D as a set of divine topics, and N will be the set of non-divine atomics, or 9 non-divine sentences in a topic. Then build the logic around that, and the logic is both truth and topic preserving. Then you can define Tertullian's barrier as follows. So E will be all true statements in D, that is in the divine topic, while T will be all true statements in N, the non-divine sentences. Then we could have the barrier as this. You can't have divine sentences from non-divine ones. Okay. I'll skip this part. Okay, so what's the ramification of this idea of defining Tertullian's barrier? Well, the philosophical punchline is, I think, apparent. Tertullian's barrier just tells you that you can't derive eternity from temporality, no divine from the created, no sacred from the profane. So one ramification of that is that you'll have a consistent Christology. So here's the puzzle, right? So if Christ is divine, then he cannot change. If Christ is human, then he can change. So you have a contradiction. But if Christ is human, it's just true in the non-divine topic, and Christ is divine, it's true in the divine topic, then we could have a consistent Christology this way. Because the first two statements will be of different topics, same as the entailments, and then you could have well, a non-contradictory Christology. Another ramification, I think, is that now you could think about other arguments for the existence of God. And here's a famous argument that a lot of people have been thinking about, the cosmological arguments, which derive the existence of the divine being from alleged facts about the created world, plus the sufficient reason, principle, or impossibility of infinite regress. But this kind of argument violates Tertullian's barrier, because if Tertullian's thesis is correct, then you can't have sentence about the divine, God exists, from sentences about the created. Okay? So cosmological arguments, unfortunately, if you're a fan of cosmological arguments, they're invalid using the thesis. Now, I could skip this part, but here's a kind of objection that you may raise, a prior-like counterexample. So imagine a complex sentence like N or D, so non-divine or divine, whatever that sentence. Is that in N or is that in E? Oh, sorry, in D. So you could run a prior-like argument, and you'll have some counterexamples to Tertullian. Or perhaps this is a more intuitive way of looking at the objection. Imagine the via negativa argument, deriving what the divine is not from what the created is. Example, we are finite, so God is not finite. So if you could have this kind of argument and it's valid, then it might be a counterexample to Tertullian's barrier. Now, a way to remedy this is to distinguish between pure or partial domain membership. So, for example, non-embedded asserted statements are purely in the domain of some divine or non-divine, while embedded or unasserted statements are only partially in the domain. So we could redefine the thesis in terms of this distinction, and we could have this. We'll just have a clause wherein the Tertullian's barrier thesis holds in cases where statements are purely in either of the two, but not both. You might say, oh, wait, does this mean that we're led to a kind of two truths view, right? So for all sentences A is either in N or in D, but not both and not neither. So if this is the case, then perhaps you could have a kind of Averroes idea that you have two truths, one divine and one non-divine. Well, our reply might be, well, there are indeed two kinds of truths, divine truths and non-divine truths. But while you can't have the barrier, that is divine conclusions from non-divine premises, you could have these kinds of argument forms, and they're valid. That is arguments, for example, arguments from divine revelation, the problem of evil, moral arguments will be valid arguments here, at least. Okay? I'll skip that. Now, you might say, if Tertullian's barrier holds, how could we rationally ground divine truths? Do we ground them via faith alone? If yes, then isn't this an extreme form of fideism? Well, I'll say yes. If we're going for the Tertullian's idea, he was an extreme fideist. As to quote him, what then has Athens to do with Jerusalem, the academy with the church, the heretics with the Christians? So yeah, that's true. We have two truths. Okay. Or perhaps we could think of it in terms of Augustine and Anselm and say, well, it's the idea that in order to make rational arguments for your beliefs, Christian beliefs or religious beliefs, you need to believe those things first. Okay. I think this leads us to a kind of autonomy thesis. If there's a moral autonomy thesis in metaethics, we could have a kind of theological autonomy thesis if Tertullian's barrier is right. The idea here is that you can't have a theology from natural reason alone. You can't arrive at divine truths without faith. What these truths entail is something that reason can validate. And I'll end here. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm trying to keep people on time so that we can just look at the back clock and keep on the schedule here, so that's easy for you to keep track of your own time. Just so you know, but thank you very much, Dr. JOAQUIN. Next paper we have is from Dr. Tien-Chun from Chinese University of Hong Kong, but also co-written with his undergraduate student, Mr. Hong Sung. So I think it's good we give a little round of applause and support for our first undergraduate presenter here. Very good. They're going to present a paper on the greatest possible being and the problem of parity. So thank you.
So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having us here and giving us this opportunity to present our paper. To begin with, let me just briefly introduce the background of this topic. Perfect being theologies believe that God is the perfect being, and there are several ways to cast this idea out. For example, God is the greatest metaphysically possible being, or God is the greatest conceivable being, or God is the being with all perfection, and so on. And for the purpose of this paper, we will focus exclusively on the conception that God is the greatest metaphysically possible being. That is GPB for short. So many perfect being theologians believe that GPB should not merely regard as an abstract general claim about the degrees of God's greatness, but they also believe that GPB is supposed to have significant consequence regarding the specific issue about God. For example, they believe that based on GPB, we may gain or acquire knowledge about God's properties through some sort of model reasoning. For example, some counterfactual reasoning. The rough idea may be put as follows. First, as God is the greatest possible being, so God cannot be in a worse state. Then let us consider some arbitrary property, say omnipotence, and ask whether God will be better were he to be omnipotent than were he to be not omnipotent. If so, then God is omnipotent as being not omnipotent would put God in worse state and vice versa. In other words, if we take some property, say omnipotence, and find that being with omnipotence is better than not being with omnipotence, we can conclude that God is omnipotent. So, despite this putative philosophical and theological potential, the aim of this paper is to challenge the viability of this project of perfect being theology by arguing that no new knowledge about God can be gained or extracted from this method. So, in fact, Jeffrey Speaks have already raised a similar objection to the method mentioned, which he calls the problem of triviality. However, we believe that Speaks' objection does not really reflect this project, for his objection presupposes some controversial principles in model metaphysics. Instead, we will put forward a different objection and argue that it's a much stronger objection, as it does not rely on any controversial principle presupposed by Speaks' objection. So here's our plan, and in section 2, we will present Speaks' problem and explain why it fails. And in the next session, we will raise our objection, which we call the problem of priority. And in section 4, we'll discuss some possible replies to our objection. So as we take it, the contribution of this paper is first to identify the problem of Speaks' objection, and second, raise a new objection to the project of perfect being theology. And 3, by formulating our objection within an actualist-friendly framework for model discourse, we hope to point to a feasible direction of rendering possible talks of God into the language of model logic without inquiry, extra ontological commitment. Speaks' objection to perfect being theology relies on a claim that perfect being theology should not only hold GPB, but also the necessity version of this claim. That is, perfect being theology should not only hold that God is the greatest metaphysical possible being, but also that necessarily God is the greatest metaphysically possible being. So the necessity version of GPP is formulated by Speaks as follows. For all x and for all possible worlds W and W star, there's no x in world W that is greater than God in world W star. Informally, the idea is just that nothing in any world is greater than God in any world. So, from this necessitation thesis, Speak claims to derive what we call the equality thesis, and which is a result of instantiate X with God in box GPP. So we put it as the slide shows. That is, God in any world is no less great than God in any world. And then Speaks argue that the equality thesis leads to a further consequence, that is, for any F, God is either necessary F or necessary not F. We call this result as Speaks' dichotomy. Next, Speaks argue, given this dichotomy, the possibility of God's being F entails the actuality of God's being F. And the proof can be put as follows. We can only assume the accessibility over different possible worlds as reflexive, and then we can derive the results as this shows. And so we call that when perfect being theology acquire knowledge about God's property through counterfactual reasoning, they have to first assert that God is possibly F and then do the comparison. However, given that the result that the possibility of God's being F already entails the actuality of God's being F, they have to first assert that God is F. So in order to inquiry whether a property is held by God, perfect being theologies already need to know something which is triviality equivalent to the claim that that property is or not a property of God. So this problem is what Speaks called the problem of triviality. And we frame the problem is that it's unclear how the inference shift from the equality thesis or box GPP to speech dichotomy may be justified. Actually, speech does not specify by which rule or which principle he derives the dichotomy from the equality thesis or box GPP. See, he simply writes that we already know box GPP that God is necessarily F or necessarily not F. So, and in fact, we think the inference is invalid as there is some kind of model in which the equality thesis hold while the claim of the speech dichotomy is false. For instance, consider Eugene Nagasawa's version of perfect being theology. Nagasawa believes that God is the greatest possible being in all worlds. And he also thinks that it could be the case that God has different property in different worlds. For example, suppose that the child of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence is strongly inconsistent. Perhaps because of some consideration regarding free and evil. So that is, in other words, is metaphysically or even logically impossible for a being to hold these three properties at the same time. Then no being, even the greatest possible being, can have all of these properties in any role. Instead, the greatest possible being might have just two of them in some role and the other two in another role. In such case, the greatest possible being might be equally good in these two roles, but it does not have some property in all possible roles. Yes. So as a result, the equality thesis is logically compatible with the negation of speech dichotomy. Hence, unless one offers some extra metaphysical or logical principle to fill the gap, there's no need for a perfect being theologist who accepts box GPP to accept the dichotomy and thus face the problem of triviality. Hence, we take that speech problem of triviality does not undermine the project of perfect being theology. So note that we are not claiming that the equality thesis does not in fact entail speech dichotomy. Rather, we are just claiming that the equality thesis is logically compatible with the negation of speech dichotomy. And therefore, there's no need for one who accept box GPP to accept the speech dichotomy.
Great, thank you. So it's now my turn. Yeah. This one?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we have seen that the speaks problem of triviality doesn't really undermine the kind of project of perfect being theology we are examining here, because there's a logical gap between box GPP and the so-called speaks dichotomy. However, we think that there's still like a quite a strong objection to to the project of perfect being theology, as the equality thesis itself, that is the claim that God in every world is no less greater than God in any other world. So this equality thesis itself has already posed a serious problem to the practice of perfect being theology. So why is this the case? Recall that perfect being theologians, they employ modal or counterfactual reasonings to discover the nature of God. But for this kind of procedure to generate substantive results, at least two conditions. There might be more, but at least two conditions must be met. The first one is for the inquired candidate property, say F, there is at least a pair of possible states of God that differ with respect to F. So if we are asking the question of whether God is omnipotent or God is not omnipotent, then we must we must find two possible scenarios, in one of which God is omnipotent, and in the other, God is not omnipotent. So we can compare these two to see which one is which one is better. And the second one, once we identify these two possible states of God, and we need to make sure that one of them is better than the other. So because God cannot be in the worst state. So if God, the state S1 is better than the state of S2, then God cannot be in state S2. So at least these two things have to be satisfied. But not only these two, some other conditions are proposed by Speaks as well. For example, there's a condition called duplication, F duplication condition, which means God, if we are asking whether God has the property of F or not, then we need to keep all other irrelevant properties the same. So for example, if we ask whether God is omnipotent or not omnipotent, then the two possible states of God we are comparing with should be keep all other properties like omissions, if omissions have nothing to do with omnipotence, and like perfect goodness, all these kind of properties as fixed. They must differ with regard to none of these properties. So this is called F duplication condition. But it doesn't matter whether this condition holds or not in our following objection. Okay, so at least A and B, these two conditions have to be satisfied. So condition of B is indispensable for the inquiry of perfect being theology, because if we do not know in which state God is better, then we cannot infer that God possesses or God does not possess the relevant property from the assumption that God must be in a better state. Right? If both states are equally good, then we cannot infer anything from like these two different states of God. So here is our objections. Since box GPB implies that all of God's possible states are equally good, that is the result of the equality thesis. So B, the condition of B can never be satisfied. Yeah, because the condition of B says that at least one of such possible state of God is better than another. But the equality thesis requires that any of God's possible states is equally good. Yes, the method of perfect being theology is based on a thesis that is box GPB, which ultimately undermines this project itself. Yeah, and yeah, okay. So we may put this in a more formal way. So for the condition of B to be satisfied, the following claim must hold true. I call it diamond GRE. So for some word W and for some words W and W star, then God in W word W is better than God in word W star. Yeah. So it's easy to show that the equality thesis and the box GRE are incompatible, because one is just the negation of the other, given the duality of quantifiers, existential quantifiers and the universal quantifiers. The box diamond GRE just says, oh, God in one word is better than God in another word. But the equality thesis is that God in any word is as good as God in any other word. So there's a direct contradiction between these two theses. So if you assume, if you accept the box GPB, then there's no way for you to do perfect being theology to discover the knowledge about God's attributes. So basically, this is our objection to our refined objection to perfect being theology. We call this the problem of parity. Yeah, it's not like Speake's argument. It says nothing about whether this procedure is trivial or not, but it relies on the idea that all of God's possible states are on the bar. They are equally good. So you cannot compare which one is better. And so you cannot derive certain kind of knowledge about God. Okay, so we turn to some objections. So the first objection we consider here is Brian Leftor. He explicitly argues against the box GPP, as he thinks that even if God is the greatest possible being in all worlds, it can still be a case that the state of God in some world is greater than the state of God in another world. Okay, we are not sure whether we fully follow the idea here, but here is one way to reply to this this objection. So we think the problem with this response is that it also undermines the project of perfect being theology. For the actual God, which is the greatest possible being in our actual world, might also be in a worse state, given Leftor's objection. So perfect being theologians would then be unable to tell whether God actually has some certain property from their model knowledge about whether having this property would put God in a better state or not, because they would not know whether the actual state of God is a better one or is a worse one. So if God is the greatest possible being in all worlds, but some possible state of God is better than some other possible state of God, then we don't know which one, in which world we are. Maybe we are in the world that God is in a worse state rather than in a better state. So that's our first objection. No, our response to the first objection. And we also consider another objection. So the second objection is Quinian. So the argument we just gave is formulated by using possibilist quantification over mere possibilia, like some other possible beings, and non-actual possible worlds. So some people might think, oh, if you use possibilist quantification, you also have the corresponding ontological commitment. But most perfect being theologians are like actualists. They do not really believe in like non-actual possibilia. So this is unfair to them. Okay, so in response, we have shown how to translate talk of God and other possible beings into a model language, a first-order model language. So basically, the language is just the standard first-order logic plus function symbols plus model operators. So to use this kind of language, we can reformulate our argument in a way that no this kind of possibilist quantifications is needed. And the last something quite noteworthy is the background logic it requires. I mean, the background logic, our reformulated arguments for the incompatibility between diamond GRE and the equality thesis is quite weak, especially no controversial S5 principles like SM4 or SMB, which means like the necessity of necessity and the necessity of possibility. This kind of iterated modality, model principles are not needed for the validity of our reformulated argument. So we don't have the space and we don't have the time to go through the detail here. But if you are interested, you can just scan the QR code and see the section 4 of our full paper. We have shown how to do this in a actualist friendly setting. So as mentioned by Hong earlier, the third contribution our paper intends to make is that we show that there are lots of talk of possibilities talk about God and about possible beings can be translated into a actualist friendly talk. So we don't need to worry about like this kind of Quinian objection to the whole project of perfect being theology. We can do it in an ontologically conservative way. Okay. So I think this is our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Luo and Mr. Hong. We now turn to our last and final speaker, who will be one of our own here from Hong Kong Baptist University, Dr. Andrew Loke. He will be presenting on using an original deductive formulation of the teleological argument to reply to outstanding objections to the argument. I cede the floor to you, sir.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Yeah, thank you, James. Hi, welcome everyone. So today I'm going to present my research on the teleological arguments, and this is taken from a book which which is published in the Palgrave Frontiers in Philosophy of Religion series, in this book I also defend the Kalam cosmological arguments, which we talked about this morning as well. And now, before I continue to talk about the teleological arguments, I can't resist saying something in response to Jeremiah's JJ paper earlier on, because I think it'll be more interesting actually if we also interact with each other rather than just with the audience, right? Because Tertullian himself also used the teleological argument. So which means that Tertullian himself wouldn't agree with the Tertullian barrier that JJ was talking about early on. So there must be something wrong, right, with JJ's interpretation of Tertullian. In fact, the well-known historian of science, Peter Harrison, in one of his articles, he has argued that many scholars have misinterpreted Tertullian on this point, because Tertullian is not saying he's not saying that he's not embracing logical absurdity. Rather, he is arguing in an ironic sense. When you read him in context, right? He's quoting 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and then arguing in an ironic sense of foolishness rather than affirming logical absurdity or logical contradictions. And I have also written an article published in the journal Sophia, where the article is titled "The Law of Non-Contradiction and Global Philosophy of Religion." And in that article, I demonstrated, in response to J.C. Bale, which JJ cited earlier on as well, that the non-classical logicians, they are actually using a different definition of negation compared to the definition of negation that is used by classical logicians. And therefore, they are talking about something else, right? They do not actually deny the validity of classical logic. And so once we use a proper definition, once we use the classical logician definition of negation, then we can conclude that if an argument is deductively valid and the premises are true, the conclusion will be true, right? As they say in Chinese, right? 一个论证只要前提正确，演绎有效，结论正确的，结论会跟前提的。Right, the conclusion will follow from the premise, right? Because deduction will preserve the truth, right? In that case, and in fact, that's the argument that I'm going to present, right? I'm going to give a deductively valid argument with true premise. And in that article, I also show that to defend the incarnation, we don't have to go the J.C. Bell route. There are various models of the incarnation, defensible models which you can use, and therefore there's no good reason to embrace or to postulate non-classical logic to the divine. On the other hand, we still need to account for what follows from deductively valid arguments based on true premise. Okay, so so that's my response to JJ in a nutshell. Okay, and so that provides the preamble, right, for me to go on and present the arguments. Okay, so let's start by talking about evidence of design. Okay, now so look at this photo. You see anybody there? Well, you don't see anybody there, right? But you know that somebody must have been there before. Why? Because you know that the words "I was here," these words couldn't have just been caused by the random forces or the natural forces or the winds or the waves. So even though you don't see anybody there, but you can infer that somebody must have been there before to write these words. So likewise, proponents of the teleological argument would argue that even though we don't see God, but based on the evidence of design which we can see, and we can infer that there must be somebody, right, who created these equations which are discovered by physics. So for example, E = mc squared. Right. Now, this equation, was it created by Einstein? No, Einstein did not create this equation. Einstein only discovered this equation. Right? Before Einstein discovered this equation was already there in the natural order. It describes how energy, mass can be interconverted. according to this equation. And there are thousands and thousands of equations which scientists have discovered. And these equations contain far more information than these simple words "I was here." Now, there are far more information, far more precise, more systematic, more highly ordered. And so if you think that these words have a designer, this information would have come from a designer. So likewise, we should conclude that this information must have come from a designer, right? So this is one of the evidence of design from the high degree of order, which we find in the physical reality. And another evidence for a designer is from what is called the fine-tuning of the universe. So many scientists in recent decades have argued that there are plenty of examples of this fine-tuning, right? That will allow for any kind of life or any kind of ordered forms of chemicals, right, to exist in the universe. So here are some examples. For the ratio of strength of gravity to electromagnetism, right, is stronger or weaker by 1 part in 10 to the power 40. Life sustaining stars like sun would have existed. Okay. And another example, dark energy, which is responsible for the acceleration of the universe expansion. This must be small enough for structures to form within the universe. And if it's too large, the expansion will extend so fast that no stars of any or any ordered system can form. If it's just slightly stronger, our universe will just be like a thin, uniform hydrogen helium soup. That's it. Right? There won't be any kind of ordered structures at all, right? And the degree of fine-tuning is on the order of 1 part 10 to the power 120. Okay, so many zeros. You can count for yourself. Another example, entropy, right? The initial state of the Big Bang must have extremely highly ordered with very high amount of usable energy. The probability of a universe chosen at random will possess the necessary degree of order is 1 in 10 to the power 10 to the power 123. Now this, okay, how big is this number? To get a sense of it, the number of atoms in the universe is approximately 10 to the power 80. Okay, that's the approximate number of atoms in the universe. And 10 to the power 123 is 1 followed by 123 zeros. Okay, so 10 to the power 10 to the power 123 is 1 followed by 10 to the power 123 zeros. This has so many digits that it cannot be written down. Even if you write it so small that each digit take up a single atom of space and convert every atom in the universe into ink, there won't be enough ink to write down the number. Okay. So that is how large the number is, okay? Or how small or how precise the fine-tuning is. So this is really astonishing, right? It stretches our beyond our imagination. Now, to have a sense of how incredible this is, let's compare with the odds of winning a lottery, right? Mark 6. Now, I don't buy lottery myself, but I think this is quite fun to think about it. Okay, so you pick 6 numbers out of 49 numbers. What's the chance of winning once? Anybody? Well, I'm short of time, so let me go on. Okay, so it's around 1 in 40 million chance, okay, of winning the lottery once. Compare with fine-tuning examples. Gravity, electromagnetic ratio, okay, this is like winning 6 times in a row, right? Dark energy density is like winning 17 times in a row, winning lottery 7 times in a row. Now, of course, we know that that doesn't happen by chance. If somebody wins it so many times, you know that something was wrong, right? The person must have designed or played some trick there. It doesn't happen by chance. Now, by entropy, right? It's like winning 1.4 to 10 to the power 3 times in a row. Okay, so it's like winning trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of times in a row. Now, of course, you know that that does not happen by chance. Okay, it must be some kind of design or some kind of other thing, right? It cannot be by chance. And so, no, this is the kind of thing that we are talking about. And these are just 3 examples, right? There are many other examples. And so, given such strong evidence, right, it's no wonder that many scientists they have come to the conclusion that there must be a designer. Right? So one of them is Sir Fred Hoyle, a physicist at Cambridge University. He was an atheist before, but he ended up concluding that there must be a super intellect who has played around with the physics, because we know that this kind of things doesn't happen by chance, as I say. Now, however, not all scientists are convinced. We know that there are still some scientists who are atheists, Stephen Hawking, Roger Penrose, for example. And in fact, Roger Penrose, interestingly, right, he was the one who he won the Nobel Prize, and he was the one who calculated the entropy fine-tuning. And so people wonder, how come Penrose himself, he didn't believe in God? He doesn't believe in God yet, right? Now, he had a recent debate with William Lane Craig, and in the debate, he No, they talk about various forms of design inference, analogical, Bayesian, etc. And Penrose's objection is this. Now, firstly, he doesn't see why God is the only solution to this fine-tuning, because there could be other possibilities which, well, we may not discover yet, right, and cannot verify. The second possibility is that, the second objection is that, on the other hand, if you just say, okay, God did it, right, I mean, this can be used to solve any problem. So it's not helpful. Okay? We should try to solve it scientifically if possible. And so these are two reasons why Penrose is not a theist yet. He hasn't been convinced by the fine-tuning argument. So in the rest of my presentation, I'm going to reply to Penrose. Okay, I'm going to address all these remaining objections to the teleological argument. And so my contribution to the discussion is that I propose a novel formulation of the teleological argument, and this is not based on appealing God. It's not based on appealing to God to solve a problem. Okay, so I'm not saying, okay, I cannot solve this, therefore God. That's not the argument. Rather, the conclusion that God exists is based on deduction and exclusion of all the alternative categories of explanations based on the essential features of these categories. Okay, and therefore, this will address Penrose's objection, right? Because Penrose's first objection is that, well, he thinks that maybe there are some other possibilities which we have not thought of yet. So I use this argument to show that there are no other possibilities. There are only these few essential possibilities. We can exclude all the alternatives and therefore conclude that it's by design. Okay? And so this is how the argument goes. Premise one, the fine-tuning and high degree of order of the universe, which I mentioned at the beginning, is either fundamentally uncaused or is fundamentally caused, right? So if it's caused, then either it's caused due to random causes, I call this chance, or it's due to non-random causes, in which case either it's due to non-intelligent, non-random cause, kind of regularity, or it's due to intelligent, non-random causes. Intelligent means design. Or it's due to a combination of random and non-random causes. Okay, so you can combine, mix and match, right? Maybe a combination of regularity and random, for example, or intelligence using a combination, right? So theistic evolution, right, or evolutionary creationism will be an example of that. Okay, so these are all the possibilities, essentially. And then I go on to argue that in the rest of my book, that the fine-tuning and order of the universe is not fundamentally due to chance, regularity, or combinations, or chance and regularity, and it's not uncaused. And therefore, it is due to intelligent cause, design. Okay, I don't have time to go through the details of my argument, but you can read my book. It's open access for the details. So I should have about 10 minutes or so, and I shall go pretty fast, right, to go through, to rule out the alternative explanations. Now, before I do that, I would like to define my terms. So what do I mean by random? I'm using it to refer to random causes and to, in a non-epistemic sense, to describe causes that bring about a variety of outcomes with varying degree of order. So for example, throwing a dice, 3 dice randomly, right? You can get 6, 6, 6 or 4, 5, 6. That'll be an example of what I mean by random. A variety of different outcomes, varying degree of order. And this is in contrast with regularity, which causes bring about outcomes that are not varied. Okay, so either it's varied or not varied, right? So not varied will be, say, for example, if I let go of this, you will drop. Let go of this, you will drop again, right? It's not varied. You keep dropping, right? So it's a regular way, right? It's not, there's no variation, right? You just keep dropping this way. And in contrast with design, whereby causes have freedom to intentionally bring about outcomes, which may be varied or not varied, but it's for a purpose, right? So for example, one indication of purpose will be functionality. That, like say for example, if you see a factory out in the outer space, if you discover a factory in Mars, you will conclude that is design. Why? Because the factory have different parts, work together, function, to produce something. So there's a purpose there. So that will be evidence of design, right? So that's what I mean by design, right? It's for a purpose. Okay, so since the list of hypotheses is logically exhaustive, okay, and I already illustrated what I mean by random and regularity and design, I show that based on this, we can show that is logically exhaustive, right, in the previous slide, given these definitions. One can then argue for the design hypothesis by exclusion without having to first assign a prior probability for design. And what I mean is that we don't have to determine that, oh, it's very likely that God will design the universe, right? We don't have to do that. All we need to do is to say that, well, there's no good, on the one hand, there's no good reason to think that it's not design. we don't have any good reason to think that God wouldn't, or we don't have any good reason to think that there's no God, or that even if there's God, he wouldn't design the universe. Okay, so there's no good reason to think that the prior probability for design is low. No good reason to think that. But on the other hand, we have very good reason to think that all the alternatives are very low. Okay, are very improbable, and so by exclusion, by elimination, we can conclude that therefore it's by design. Okay. So that's what I mean, right? So we don't have to prove that there's a high prior, right? But all we need to show is that there's no good argument against design, but good argument against the rest. And we can therefore conclude that it's by design. And so using this formulation, we can avoid the objections by critics such as Elliot Sober and on this point entirely, right? Because Sober argued that, well, we cannot read the mind of God, right? You don't know how likely is it that God will, if there's a God, he will design the universe. And so I respond to this point using my methodology, my way of argumentation. Okay, so let's go through quickly to exclude all the other alternative possibilities. Can it be by chance? Well, I already explained that it's extremely low probability, right? That you wouldn't win a lottery trillions and trillions of times in a row. That doesn't happen by chance. It's extremely unlikely that atom or proton or a molecule will just consistently move according to the equations described by physics all the time in a regular ordered way. Why? Because a particle, it's possible that it could have moved in billions of alternative directions at each moment, rather than consistently in the direction describable by any form of mathematical equation. And so chance, no way. Now, sometimes I hear some students, undergraduates especially, they say that, well, the fine-tuning argument doesn't give you 100% certainty. Okay, yeah, the chance is very, very slow. The chance is very, very small, right? But it's not zero. My response is that we do not need 100% logical certainty to know something is true. So for example, there isn't 100% certainty that what you're reading down on the slide is randomly typed by a monkey. Anybody believe that? No, I would not. Okay, so rather than, of course, that is logically possible. The possibility is not zero, but it's highly unlikely. Okay, that these words are randomly typed by a monkey by chance. Okay. And I would say, and I've already shown just now that random fine-tuning and the high degree of order I mentioned just now is even more unlikely than these words randomly typed by a monkey, right? I already showed just now, just entropy alone, right, is even if all the atoms become ink, not enough to write down, that is even more fine-tuned than these words on the slides. And so it's ridiculous, right, to think that the fine-tuning is just by chance. Winning a lottery trillions of times in a row does not happen by chance. Okay? So what I'm saying here is that we do not need to have 100% logical certainty to know that something is true. Right? Okay, another objection is that sometimes people use the entropic principle, right? They say, well, if this condition were not fine-tuned, we wouldn't be here, but since we are here, we shouldn't be surprised. But John Leslie has already refuted this way of reasoning. He said that imagine you're a criminal, you drag before a firing squad of 100 marksmen, all of them missed when they fire. Right? You wouldn't say that, well, it'll be ridiculous to think that, well, since I'm still alive, I shouldn't be surprised that all of them missed. Rather, you should still ask, how come, why did all of them miss, right? What's the explanation? What's the explanation for that? Okay. The observation that all the marksmen miss still requires an explanation. Likewise, the fine-tuning still requires an explanation. The entropy principle does not explain it. Now, what about multiverse? Okay, so this morning we heard from Aaron Seagal, right? He talked about multiverse. And this is used by Stephen Hawking and many atheists to try to rebut the conclusion of fine-tuning. Now, this does not work. Okay, as Robin Collins and others have argued, even if there are many universes, the process which led to their formation would itself require fine-tuning. In order to stably generate so many different kinds of universe, you need to have a great variety of universe, right? In order to generate one that's fine-tuned by chance. Otherwise, if it's just very boring universe like A or B, it doesn't explain fine-tuning. So there needs to be a great variation, and also make sure that there must be enough energy, usable energy, right, to result in so many universes. And also make sure that one universe doesn't collide with another. So a lot of conditions need to be exactly right in order for a universe that is so fine-tuned to be generated by so-called chance, right? So this hypothesis doesn't explain away fine-tuning. It will require fine-tuning, okay? And so it's a useless hypothesis. It doesn't rebut the teleological arguments. All right, so that's all for chance. It doesn't work. Now, what about regularity? No, it doesn't work either, because regularity just pushed the question one step back. How could such a mindless regularity generate a universe with such a high degree of regularity, right? The mathematical describable order, which I mentioned at the very beginning, which can be described by the physics equations of physics, that is the regularity, the high degree of regularity that we are trying to explain. So it's useless to point out that some laws of nature can be explained by other laws, by other regularities. But because the question then comes back, well, what about that regularity, right? How do you explain that? And so this just begs the question. It doesn't solve the problem. Now, what about chance plus regularity? So for example, evolution, chaos theory. Now, again, it doesn't work. Why? Because for such a process to happen, a high degree of order such that the particles, for example, do not move in billions of alternative directions at each moment, chaotically, totally chaotically. Now, there must already be some order there, right? Even the so-called chaos theory, there is a statistical order that's already there. Likewise for evolution as well, right? The natural selection and other laws must already be there. And so that remains unexplained, right? How do you account for that order at the first place? And so these theories, they fail to explain away design. Why? Because they only apply to a certain kind of order, intermediate order. That's the order when certain more fundamental orders are already there, then a higher degree of order can emerge or evolve, right, over a process over time. And whereas the argument that I'm offering here concerns order at the most fundamental level, at the level of the laws of nature, at the level of the fine-tuning of the initial, at the initial beginning, right? So this kind of argument cannot be refuted or rebutted by evolution or any kind of chance plus regularity hypothesis. And so again, this does not work. Now, finally, why not think that this order is just uncaused? After all, theists believe that God is uncaused, right? So why not believe that the laws of nature are also uncaused? Now, there are two reasons. One is that we can use the cosmological argument to refute this hypothesis. So I've written 2 books on the cosmological argument, and I've demonstrated that the universe has an ultimate beginning. There's a first event, and so whatever begin to exist will require a cause, and so it's not uncaused, right? So, so using the cosmological argument is one way to reply to this objection. Now, however, I think that the teleological argument can be defended independently of the cosmological argument too, right? So we don't have to use the cosmological argument, although we can use, but we don't have to, right? And that's the my second response is not dependent on the cosmological argument. Okay, so let's think about a hypothetical scenario in which particles randomly form long chains which spell out God created the universe. Okay. And then if you see that, right, happening in front of you, and then the scientists just say, oh, no, nothing need to be explained, it's just uncaused. Now, of course, that would be ridiculous, right? It'll be just like if you see the words, I was here on the beach, and somebody just say, oh, this is formed by laws of physics uncaused, and the laws are uncaused. Now, of course, you wouldn't accept that hypothesis, that conclusion, right? It will be ridiculous to say that. Now, why is it unconvincing? The reason is because the mindless uncaused entity does not render such highly organized complexity probable or expected, right? You wouldn't expect to see this, it's just uncaused, like the words I was here or what, right? That it just have such a high degree of information there. And so that's the problem with this. It has very low explanatory power. Therefore, it's also likewise unconvincing to object that a fine-tuned universe is not evidence of design by claiming that these are just uncaused. Okay, why? Because this high degree of order and fine-tuning would be unexpected if fundamental reality is unintelligent. On the other hand, we do not have good reason to think that such high order and fine-tuning would be unexpected if fundamental reality is intelligent design. Okay, 3 more minutes, right? 5, okay. Now, as Luke Barnes have stated, physics is blind to what life needs. Physics doesn't care about us, right? The law of gravity doesn't care about whether you live or die, but yet here we are. So if you say it's just uncaused, right, that doesn't explain, right? Because uncaused, unintelligent laws of nature wouldn't care whether we live or die. And therefore, it's much more reasonable to think that fundamental reality is not uncaused, but rather, it's not unintelligent uncaused, right? But rather is intelligent uncaused, okay, which is God. So fundamental reality has intentional powers, which themselves do not depend on fine-tuned material, but intentional powers allow the foundation of reality to aim for interesting ends, such as evolution leading to a complex creature which can make a princess drawing. With intentional powers at the foundation, we have a mechanism to explain why the world unfolds towards something beyond mere dots of dust. This mechanism provides the probability pump, which renders organized complexity far more probable expected. Okay, so that's the point of my argument. Okay, so that completes my argument for a designer. And just one brief response to David Hume's argument from imperfection, right? Hume says that, well, but there are natural disasters. Our universe also has imperfection. Sometimes we see some degree of disorder as well. Now, how do you explain that? My response is that even if, okay, so if you were to discover in a moon or a jungle, a factory which has capacity for making motor cars, you should conclude that it was designed, even if some parts are faulty, right? Even if there's some degree of disorder somewhere, but when you see a factory, you should conclude it's designed. Why? Because it is unreasonable to think that the components of the factory are fundamentally brought together, assembled by chance, regularity, or combinations of chance, and there are no other possibilities, as I already shown, right? And so you should conclude that this is design. So the fact that some parts are faulty does not refute this conclusion. One might think that, well, it may be due to faulty, imperfect designer, but then there are other possible explanations. Say, for example, it may be initially perfect, but later spoiled by someone else, right? That's also possible. And so this, so on the one hand, the presence of imperfection does not rebut the conclusion that there is a designer. It doesn't rebut my argument at all. On the other hand, my argument still follows, right? The designer conclusion of designer still follows from my premise. And so this brings me to a discussion of the problem of evil against God, which we talked about this morning. So what I'm going to say here is that I have a book on the problem of evil, right? So if you're interested, you can check out my book published by Routledge. So in this book, one of the arguments I mentioned in response is that the argument from evil does not refute the existence of God, but only the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God, okay? Even if it's successful. And therefore, the argument from evil does not rebut the cosmological argument. Neither does it rebut the teleological argument, which shows that there is a designer, creator. So in other words, there must still be someone up there, okay, who transcends the universe and created and designed the universe. And then one can proceed to argue that given God's transcendent power and knowledge, he might know of good reasons for allowing evil, even if we finite beings may not know what these reasons are. And therefore, the argument against an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God failed as well, right? Because this someone up there is so beyond our intelligence. He may know of good reasons for allowing evil, for example. So the fact that we don't know these reasons doesn't mean that there's no reason that is known to him. Now, in my book, I also defend other theologies in response to animal suffering, etc. No time to go through. But just want to say the argument from evil failed. Okay, so no time to go through this. In conclusion, I've already shown how the conclusion of designer follow from the premises of my argument by deduction. And we can conclude that, well, the alternatives to design are unlikely, as already shown. There's no good reason to think that the design hypothesis is unlikely. And the presence of imperfection, that doesn't mean that design is unlikely, right, as already shown. And I already explained, if an argument is deductively valid, premises are true, conclusion is true. Okay, conclusion follow. And therefore, I already shown that the teleological argument is deductively valid, and I have also shown that the premises are true. And to show that the premises are true, we do not need 100% certainty, as I said, right? We already have extremely overwhelmingly high probability to know that the premises are true, and therefore the conclusion follow. A designer, God exists, is true. Thank you.
At this point, I don't know if we have decided that our policy is going to be, are we going to take big groups of questions, or can we do one at a time? Because I think we have enough time. I don't know who makes that decision. I guess it's me. So I will make the call and say, I think what we will do is we will take questions one at a time. So I think that's the better way to go. So I see two in the back. Why don't we go to you, sir, first?
Hey, oh, great. I had a question for Dr. JOAQUIN. So what do you think about the following argument? Eternal truths are necessary truths. Necessary truths are trivially entailed by any proposition. A fortiori, they're entailed by temporary propositions, so there's no substantive barrier in the vicinity.
Yeah, thanks. Interesting. So let me just check the inference there. So eternal truths are necessary truths, right? So that's a premise.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty stable position, I think, throughout most of the classical philosophical theological tradition.
Right. Then from there, what's the next premise?
Necessary truths are entailed by any proposition, trivially.
Mm-hmm.
So a fortiori, they're entailed by
the
temporary ones, yeah.
Right. Yeah, okay. So let me think about this. Mm-hmm. Do we have a specific eternal truth that we're thinking about here? So how do you, sorry for asking the question, your question, but I'm thinking, because we're trying to cash out the idea that we can't have statements about the divine from statements about the non-divine. I think that's the barrier I'm talking about. So unless you have a specific divine sentence in mind, I can't really.
Maybe,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I just think the concern is that divine truths are always going to have a particularly robust modal standing. So
Right.
they're necessarily true of true.
Mm.
So I should be able to run the argument without having to pony up any particular proposition. It's just in the nature of the divine that whatever is thus and so is also necessarily thus and so.
Yeah, okay. No, because I'm trying to block your first statement that eternal truths are necessary truths. Because unless, if I define eternal truths in terms of a prior like definition that is true, past, present, future, then that might not be a divine truth, right? So, not sure whether, the thing that I want to talk about really handles the problem, the example here. I hope that makes sense.
maybe we can move on then to Dr. Zapul.
I have a question for the second pair of speakers. And so I was just thinking like of a couple of ways in which one could try to defend perfect being theology against your objection. I wonder if you thought about that and if you have thoughts. So the first one would be to just consider impossible worlds, right? So even if it is not possible that God doesn't have omniscient, what I can consider an impossible world where God is not omniscient, and I can say, okay, the God that you would have in that world is worse. And then the other one would be to say, well, perhaps I can evaluate whether a property is a great making property without considering the case where God doesn't have that property. Maybe have independent reasons to think that knowledge is the kind of property that makes a being greater, right? So God must have that to the possible extent, and to make that claim, I don't have to consider the possible world in which God doesn't have knowledge, right? So, yeah.
Before you answer, I just want to alert people, I am taking a cue. So I know some people are looking at me and raising their hands, but just so you know, if you want to be on the queue, please do that. Catch my attention and I'll put you in the list. Thank you.
So so thank you for these two suggestions. So for the first one, the impossible worlds. So in fact, in the very beginning of the talk, we specify the scope of our discussion. That is, we focus on a certain kind of specific kind of conception of God. That is, God, a specific conception of a perfect being. That is the greatest metaphysically possible being. Yeah, so some other people do appear to like impossible worlds to do their perfect being theology project. So one way is to take God to be the greatest conceivable being. And then they also use possibilist quantifier to talk about like possible worlds and something beyond possible worlds, like conceivable but not possible worlds. So that we take that to be impossible worlds. Yeah, so we just leave it aside. But I do think the same kind of worry applies to like a conceivable version of perfect being theology. The reason is, if you have like in the current version, we have a so-called box GPB, right? The necessity of God's being the greatest possible being. So maybe they also have their own version of the inconceivability of God's not being the greatest conceivable being. So basically, you change the possibility here, necessity here to be its duality in conceivability. That is not conceivable to be not. Yeah, then the same kind of argument might still go through. Yeah. Okay. That's the first one. The second one is, yeah, that's another version of perfect being theology, and we also set it aside. I have a paper myself that try to defend this kind of perfect being theology. So in this talk, we did. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, so this is a question for Professor Joachim on his objection to the cosmological argument. Andrew presented one response where he's suggesting that Tertullian interprets, or at least you might interpret Tertullian wrongly, but I would like to say perhaps there's a way under which the way you present Tertullian's argument can indeed be seen as, or at least the cosmological argument can be seen as a valid argument under Tertullian's argument as well. And the way I hold this, or at least the suggestion that I would like to see your response to, is to say, well, if Tertullian grants an incarnational model of God, which you accept, and to say, well, Christ has in its profane or natural sense a natural nature, which is human, and a God divine nature, which is divine and transcendent, well, and the cosmological argument is such that it defends the idea that there is one first cause. In the literature surrounding the cosmological argument, that first cause could be material, like someone says there's a first brute fact, or a cause of the universe, which is a brute fact, or someone, I could imagine a cosmological argument saying that, well, there is a physical cause of the universe, but its act of causation is physical, even if the nature of the cause itself might not be fully physical. So for example, God, if Tertullian accepts an incarnational model of God, then you could have God having both the natural and a non-natural nature, where his natural nature creates the universe or causes the nature in a natural sense. So the cosmological holds under that idea of God, even if his non-natural idea of God or the non-natural nature of God does not necessarily cause the universe and act in that act of creation. So even if God himself is not natural, he can still create the universe, or the cosmological argument could still hold to point towards God under that reading, because God, as Tertullian says, has that human nature as well, or that natural nature to cause the universe in that sense. I was wondering what you would say to that.
Yeah, thanks. There are a lot of things to unpack there. So first, let's think about, we're thinking about the triune God here, the Christian God. So you have the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. And when we say that Christ, the Son, has a dual nature, both human and divine, I'm not sure you could attribute that to the Father, even though they have that triune relation. So I'll just let me think about that first. But yes, I'll agree that if God has that both dual nature as well, the creator God that we're talking about, yeah, cosmological argument actually we would follow and would pass Tertullian's barrier. But actually, Andrew's point a while ago made me think about not that kind of premise, but the principle of sufficient reason. That's really the underlying principle in most of these cosmological arguments, the teleological argument, and so on. I wonder whether our assumption about the principle is something like it has some theistic underlying premise there somewhere, or perhaps we're thinking about the principle in terms of an ultimate explanation, ultimate reason for everything. Because if we're thinking about the principle of sufficient reason, full stop, that there's a reason for something, that might not be a theological premise or a statement about the divine. But if you're thinking about it in terms of the ultimate explanation of things, perhaps there's a kind of underlying theology there or something. If it is in that kind of ultimate reason idea, then the cosmological argument will pass through the barrier, I think. So again, the barrier I'm talking about, whether it's Tertullian or not, it's just the idea that you can't have statements about the divine from statements about the non-divine. So that's a thesis. But of course, you could smuggle in some divine statements in your premise set, and that would lead to valid arguments. So that passes a barrier. So if you could have that kind of God talk where he has a dual nature as well, then yeah.
Okay. I think we have Dean Zimmerman is next. Yes.
Are identity statements going to count as atomics? And if so, if Jesus walked on water is not an eternal statement, and God is good is an eternal statement, then what about Jesus is identical with God?
I don't want to talk about the Trinity here because it's one of those things that made people crazy, including J.C. Beale, because he has this weird idea of identity statements, right? That it's both true and false of God that he's identical with. Yeah, you could have that kind of story. You could have that kind of non-classical story that Christ is identical with God, with the Father, in terms of that triune theology, but he's not identical because there are properties of Christ which are not properties of God. So it's true, and it's both true and false of God that he's identical with. So you can have that kind of story. I'm not buying it. Sorry, JC, if you're watching. I'm not buying that story. I'm not sure how to think about identity statements, but whether they're atomics, that's a good question. I have to think about that. If they're simple sentences in the theology, if they are, then I'll have a problem in the formulation barrier. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. And now we have Aaron Segal.
Thank you. Also a question for JJ. And maybe I misunderstood the claim, but I'm having trouble understanding the claim that the barrier only holds in one direction and not in the other. And you gave, an example even of where you'd be okay going from the eternal to the temporal. So, divine relation that P, infer that P. So I don't know if it's true in general that the negation of a divine statement is divine statement, or the negation of a creaturely statement is a creaturely statement, but it seems like there will be some examples, including that kind. So the claim that it's not the case that God revealed that P would seem to be a divine statement, and it follows from it being the case that not P, if you grant that P follows or is entailed by God revealed that P.
Yeah. Actually, I'm thinking about via negativa arguments there, right? So we say we're not, we're mortal, therefore God is not mortal, or yeah. Negations are a tricky thing. I'm not sure if they're atomics in the sense that I'm trying to play around with those things. If they are, then yeah, perhaps we could have counterexamples to the barrier I was talking about, but I have that kind of clause where you could have that pure versus impure membership, right? So yeah, if you could have that kind of story for the atomics, I'm not talking about the literals. So the literals could have the negations there. But if you just have the atomics, then perhaps I could have the barrier there. But that's a good question because most of the arguments from Jewish philosophers, like Maimonides or via negativa arguments, right? So I don't know. I don't know if I've answered your question, but I'm thinking about that question too. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't mean to monopolize, but I just want to make a point that I wonder, which is
Dominicans.
well, I could say things about whether Jesus is a part of God and all that, heresy bells. But I do want to say I wonder that the principle you derived from Tertullian doesn't seem to be in Tertullian. What you cited from him was the claim that God is very unlike things here.
Yeah.
That doesn't entail this thesis. What Williams said perhaps entailed that thesis, but I don't see that was anything Tertullian was affirming. Is like you can't reason. He was, I think, in my reading is a very plausible principle that's like this. If things are like this, you can't reason to what God is like simply from by analogy from what do I want to say? You can't just reason God is like the temporal objects around you or something like that. But we could give a very common sense. But what he actually said was something like God is not like the things around us, which I thought was not a very I mean, that doesn't support the complicated Williams claim. So I throw that out there. We had another comment from over here.
Yes, please. My question also is about JOAQUIN's formulation of the argument. I think that there is one trivial way Marcion can avoid the barrier. For instance, he can reformulate the point as follows. Premise 1, God can't be degraded, and premise 2, if Jesus has a flesh side, then God will be degraded. Therefore, Jesus can't be having one human side. In that way, the premise 2 is only one statement, and it's not one inferential or deduction. So there is no barrier to cross. And if you want to reject the premise 2, there will be the other tools to use than the entailment barrier.
Let me just check if I got the argument. So you're saying the second premise is about Christ being degraded because he's human. What's the first premise?
God can't be degraded or any divine being.
God cannot be.
Yes.
But yeah, I think the underlying assumption there is a kind of identity statement that God is Christ or whatever. I'm not sure.
You can refer the two premises by referring both to divine.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is divine and he can't be degraded, and yet if he has one human flesh side, he will be degraded, and therefore, by modal tolerance, he won't be having one human side.
Yeah, but I think you have a divine sentence in the premise set. So yeah, it's all right. That's a way to pass a barrier. Actually, that's not a tutorial. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Michael?
I'll ask a question for Professor Loke since he hasn't got one yet. Thanks for the presentation. About the multiverse generator, would the chances of it being fine-tuned by chance be larger than the constants of physics being fine-tuned by chance? And if so, it might still be a very small probability, but maybe larger than the constants of physics being by chance. Could we then add like a generator, something that generated the generator, and then would that, the fine-tuning of the generator have a bigger probability of being fine-tuned by chance? And then can we just keep going back until the probability is big enough? And we could just say, okay, that was just by chance.
Big enough as in?
As in the chance of it just being fine-tuned so that it in the right way.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, thank you for your question. Okay. So just now I mentioned that in order to account for the fine-tuning of the entropy, and which is extreme, right? And also other factors like cosmological constant, all this. If you want to use multiverse to explain all that, right, then there need to be lots of universe, right? There'll be trillions and trillions and trillions of universe to make it probable, right? That's large enough, right? And so to generate all these different universe, well, again, you need a lot of usable energy as well. You cannot just have one universe, two universe, and then run out of energy. It wouldn't work. And you need other factors, the expansion, things like that, and the way you expand, right, shouldn't collide with each other. So I mentioned all conditions which are related, right, to those conditions of fine-tuning which I mentioned earlier. And so what I'm trying to say is that, as Luke Barnes and Robin Collins have argued, those actually get transferred up to the higher level at the multiverse level. So the multiverse doesn't actually make it more likely, actually, right? Rather, you still need to have a lot of entropy, right? You still need to have a lot of those other conditions, and so. You cannot just say, okay, maybe there's one generator explained by another generator, explained by another generator, and ultimately can explain it away. I don't think so, because it still gets transferred up. So that is my response. And also I want to add my response to JJ, actually, because just now you asked me a question. And I was thinking of asking you a question because nobody asked me a question just now. So I was thinking of asking you. Right, so I just trying to respond to you. As I think it's thank you for this. I think it's very interesting dialogue. Thank you. So you're just now you said that what I said made you think about the PSR, right? So my response is this: my design argument doesn't depend on the PSR. Actually, I don't think so. But rather, I'm arguing based on the probability of, we think about events happening and how likely one event followed by another in a regular way. So I don't think that there's any appeal to PSI in any step of my teleological argument. As for the cosmological argument, my defense of the cosmological argument, now there are different versions of the cosmological argument, right? The Leibnizian version, for example, depends on the PSR. But the way I defend the cosmological argument, the Kalam version in my book doesn't require the PSR, right? It's based on the causal principle, not the PSR. And so I don't think my objection is susceptible to the worry that you raise. Thank you.
Okay. Do you still want to be on the queue then, or do you think you've said what you? Okay, good. Thank you. Now we've got back here. Sorry, in the front. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, sir.
Yeah.
Very good.
A question for the last speaker again, Professor Loke. Maybe it's an alternative possibility to take into account. Take Spinoza's God, at least in some readings. It realizes all possibilities by necessity, so all possible universes must arise, and that God has the energy to bring them about. So there is something that enables universes or multiverses even. But it would be counterintuitive to call it design, because there's no purpose. All arises by necessity. Would that be an alternative to take seriously? That explanation for fine-tuning, or is it in one of the other categories?
Well, thank you so much. So this seems to me, okay, so first of all, we need to define a bit clearly what does Spinoza God means, right? Is the Spinoza God really an intelligent being or non-intelligent being? If it's non-intelligent, then you'll be classified under one of the categories I mentioned just now, right? It's uncaused non-intelligent, right? The last one I discussed earlier, right? And I explained that given that hypothesis, we wouldn't expect to see this high degree of order and fine-tuning. It would be unexpected given that, as I said just now, an unintelligent thing is blind to what life needs, and yet here we are, right? So that that doesn't work. So that'll be the similar response to that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now I think it's sir in the back.
Thank you. I want to respond to Professor Lowe's critique of the project of perfect being theology. I think to investigate the nature of the greatest possible being, we do not need condition A or B. I think we can, if we want to investigate the nature of the greatest possible being, we can just conceive two individuals, X and Y. They have identical properties except one. For example, X possesses greater benevolence than Y, and that all other properties are identical, okay, except this one. X possesses greater benevolence than Y. And then we can ask, would X thereby be greater than Y? Now, if the answer is affirmative, then we have good reason for thinking that benevolence is a great-making property, and that God, therefore, as the greatest possible being, should possess or must possess the property to the fullest possible degree, that is only benevolence. And then we can go on and when we can go on and ask, now suppose both X and Y have identical properties, both of them are benevolent. How about there's one difference between them, that is X is also X also possesses knowledge, a great degree of knowledge than Y. So if this is the only difference, and then we could ask, would X thereby be greater or more perfect than Y? If the answer is affirmative, then we can affirm that knowledge is also a great-making property, and that God therefore must possess only omniscience. And so in this way, we can also determine the nature of the greatest possible being without employing condition A or B.
Yes, so I think this is also another version of project of perfect being theology we setting aside in the very beginning of our talk. Yeah, so this is a version that David mentioned earlier, his second suggestion, that we focus on a specific property and to ask whether this property is a great making property or is a perfection. Yeah. So as I say in my previous response, yeah, I had another paper, yeah, in defense of this kind of approach. But in this paper, our target is, yeah, quite clear. It's just a specific version of perfect being theology. So yeah, and for this version of perfect being theology, we do believe that the conditional A and B, they are both indispensable. Yeah.
Okay, and thank you.
Thank you. I have a question to Professor Andrew Locke. It seems to me that if God created all these rules so precise, so fine-tuned, that they are unbreakable. If you change slightly gravity or dark matter, the universe will collapse. But God also make rules in morality, like the Ten Commandments. But people, for example, God rules that people should work 6 days and rest for the other. But people break rules. These rules that God create are broken compared to the physical rules. So what do you think about the morality side of the God? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. Yeah, so for the morality side, now, first of all, for the physical side, I think God make the laws and the conditions in such a highly ordered, systematic, and also you mentioned precise way, right? So, and this is actually a kind of this indicates that is meant to what there are many purposes. One of the purpose is to indicate that there's a creator, right? As what the Bible says in Romans chapter 1 verse 20, that his invisible quality is manifested in the things he made. So it's to provide evidence to let people know that he's there, that there's somebody up there. As for the laws of morality, I think those laws are given for other purposes, and is to one of which is to allow for beings like us who have free will, and we get to choose whether we would want to follow those rules, those laws out of love for God, or would we want to be ignore him and focus on ourselves, our own selfishness, or create idols of our own, right? Would we reject him or not, right? And so yeah, those rules are meant for other purposes, right? And so that's why God allowed people to break those rules. Yeah, but he also provides redemption in the person of Jesus Christ, who accomplished atonement and salvation for us, so that by his atonement we can be reconciled and obtain forgiveness and have a relationship with him. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have our final question back here, if that's all right. No, you go, you go. You have 1 minute.
I want to ask questions to Andrew Locke. Hello, yes, long time no see. Yes, I want to ask questions about the multiverse theory. If as you mentioned, the universe is created out of certain material or energy. What if the generator created one universe after one universe, just one by one? It created a universe, but for whatever reason, the first one is collapsed. The first one has collapsed, and then by chance, this actual world, this actual universe was created, and every just by chance, or this universe after it was created, and it stops creating another universe. So then would we explain away the creator God or whatever, or is it a good alternative to the fine tuning arguments? Yes, thank you.
Thank you for the question. No, I don't think this objection works. Why? Because just like you say, okay, one universe after another, right? So this one collapsed, the previous one collapsed by chance, and then somehow generates this our present one by chance. But as I said just now, right, in order to account for the entropy, the high degree of entropy, right, the chance will have to be extremely, that is just by chance is too low, right, to be true, right? Just like winning a lottery. No. So one time after another, by chance, for trillions of times, no, it doesn't work. Analog, in that sense.
What the generator could really create a trillions of trillions universe, and the last one is this one.
Okay, so if you say that there are trillions and trillions of universe before this one, then the entropy would need to be the usable entropy, right? We need to have enough usable energy, right? Trillions and trillions of universe ago, such that you can sustain enough universe that you can have so many one after another, and in order to arrive at the present one, right? So the entropy itself will also need to be fine-tuned, right? In that sense, right? You have a lot of usable energy to do that, and not only entropy but also other conditions as well, right? So if you collapse and it must somehow be able to re-expand again, but then the cosmological constant and other conditions also need to be right, because otherwise it may just collapse and never expand again after 1 or 2 times rather than trillions of times. So yeah, a lot of other conditions would still need to be there. And also finally, right, the laws of nature themselves will also need to be there as well in order to allow for trillions and trillions of time one after another. As I said just now, right, particles could have moved in billions of alternative directions at each moment. One time, E equal mc squared equal, one time equal mc cubed, mc4, whatever, right? It could be totally chaotic. But why is it constantly so, right? That allows the laws of nature in that sense. If there's no laws of nature, then it cannot be trillions and trillions of times one after another, right? It will just be totally chaotic, and that's it. No high order would ever exist if that's the case.
And as a reminder, thank you very much, everybody. As a reminder, we are not chaos. We are order. So thank you. We'd like to thank our speakers. We are at time. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have I believe, a 15-minute break. Is that correct? And we should be back in 16:30.